Good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie Hart, and I have the honor of serving as the president and CEO of BioNJ, the voice of the life sciences industry in New Jersey. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning. We could not be more excited for BioNJ's inaugural MBA business plan competition. And our mission at BioNJ is to help our members help patients. And it is with this vision of health equity for all that BioNJ launched our overarching health equity and clinical trials strategic initiative. Health equity is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. The life sciences sector plays a major role in addressing equity of care, and BioNJ believes that that role can be expanded. That's why we're here. We have a moral imperative that requires business solutions that address this critical need. So the goal of the Health Equity and Clinical Trials MBA Business Plan Case Competition is to promote the next generation of diverse clinical trial innovators, that's you, and to identify revolutionary business models, which you are going to do along with us. So by discovering new approaches, utilizing new technologies, and developing new business standards to make trials more accessible, we can work to create more agile, inclusive, and patient-centered medical research. And we are thrilled and grateful that you have signed on to participate. And I just can't wait to see the results and award our winners with more than $20,000 in cash prizes when we meet in person in December on the 3rd. Just as importantly, I'm excited for our students to have this unique opportunity to interact with and learn from our industry leaders, industry thought leaders on this important topic. Perhaps you'll even be inspired to make this your life's work. We shall see. So before we get started, I'd like to thank our steering committee, many of whom are with us this morning, industry supporters, volunteers, and especially our partners, which includes Bristol Myers Squibb, Medidata, Amicus Therapeutics, PTC Therapeutics, Sanofi, Insmed, Psychogenics, Thermo Fisher Scientific, and Crowley Law. And our amazing partners at the Kith Collective, Kim McCleary and Samantha Mayberry, who have provided thought leadership and strategic insights all along the way. We would not be here without them. And also the BioNJ team, who is my partner, my foundation, and enables everything that we do at BioNJ. And there are many of our team members with us this morning. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Howard, Senior Director of Public Policy at Amicus Therapeutics, where he is responsible for ensuring appropriate implementation of public policy initiatives that help shape the environment for the development of products for the treatment of rare and genomic disorders. Previously, Dr. Howard was Senior Advisor to the Commissioner of the FDA on Regulatory Policy, Strategic Innovation Initiatives, and promoting competition to advance public health and safety. So the bottom line, he knows of what he speaks, and the MBA business plan case competition was his brainchild. And with that, Dr. Paul Howard.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you for your leadership at BioNJ for the Health Equity Initiative. Incredibly proud to be part of this initiative with the terrific team that you've assembled and our partners in the Kith Collective. I wanted to start by just sharing a little story. In my previous life, when I worked at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, as you might imagine, we had a lot of challenges. This was pre-COVID, but still there are a lot of challenges across the enormously complex field of drug and biologics development. And I would come to one of my colleagues in the Office of the Commissioner and be excited. I found a problem, I thought I had a solution. And he would say to me, Paul, slow your roll. If you found a problem, the chances are it's a very hard problem. If it was easy, someone else would have fixed it by now. I took those words to heart, and I look forward to working with all of you to address the very challenging, very hard, but solvable problems we face today in the health equity space. It's going to take leadership and commitment to our role as public health innovators to stake out clear tools and technologies to help us bring more patients into the clinical trial ecosystem so that we can improve health outcomes for them by bringing them up to the standard of care that is possible through clinical trials, and also to expand our state of knowledge to deliver more tailored and personalized information about health outcomes to physicians and people living with serious and chronic diseases so they can make more informed healthcare decisions. We are, and I am, of course, in the biotech business. I'd like to say just a quick word about that business. What is it? It's the alleviation of human suffering and the increase in human flourishing and broad improvement in public health through the development of therapeutics. Eradicating smallpox, curing polio, and delivering highly effective antiretroviral drugs for HIV/AIDS, transforming what was once a death sentence into a manageable chronic disease. And now the development of RNA vaccines that have helped us restart our economies and rejoin our loved ones are just a few of the achievements of this industry. But ultimately, our job, not to put too fine a point on it, is to put ourselves out of business. We want to develop therapeutics that are so effective and safe that we can cure the diseases that we are faced with, restore people to the fullest health that's possible, and allow them to live lives without having to think of themselves as people living with diseases. But to do that, we need data, we need information, we need patients to participate in clinical trials, which are also the longest, most expensive, most challenging part of the clinical trial development process and the entire drug development process overall. For complex reasons deriving both from historical discrimination and abuse and socioeconomic realities about who gets the opportunity to participate in clinical trials, participation in those trials does not reflect either the broad makeup of American society or the true epidemiology of many serious and life-threatening diseases, from rare diseases to common cancers. That means the products that do get approved by regulators may not be as effective or even as accessible to many populations that are underrepresented in clinical trials. Excuse me. That is the problem we are asking you to help us solve today. That's where you and your teams come in. Whether this is your first business competition or your 10th, we need your help, we need your insight, we need your experience, not just as MBA students, but as informaticists, public health graduates, and other cross-functional students to help us bring new perspectives, outside the box tools to solve these problems. And I'm going to stop right now while I still have my voice. But let me hand it back to Debbie for her to introduce the rest of the team.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you. And certainly, for your continued support, leadership, and guidance really in bringing this program to life. So for our next speaker, so despite traversing the globe and in a new city every week, it seems, in fact, I look back at our recent text exchanges and it was Barcelona, Paris, and Geneva just over the last couple of weeks. So our next speaker has led our Health Equity and Clinical Trials Initiative. He's a BioNJ board member. He's led it with vision, passion, and inspiration, and a healthy dose of humor, which makes it just so much fun to work with this gentleman. So to review the mission of the initiative, it is my honor to introduce BioNJ board member, Senior Vice President of Global Policy, Advocacy, and Government Affairs for Bristol Myers Squibb, the delightful Dr. Amadou Diarra. Amadou, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm always impressed when you introduce me this way, and I thought you were talking about somebody else, actually. But, very good morning to everybody. I'm really thrilled to be part of this session today. The moment has come. Actually, a lot of you on the screen don't know for how long we have anxiously awaited that moment. So I'm breaking the secret. So let me start with a few thanks to you, Debbie, Paul, the BioNJ team, of course, peer companies, all the speakers of today, because you're going to have, a lot of expertise, displayed today. Also, I do want to thank, co-sponsors and, my team member here, Patty Doikos, who really helps me, through this initiative. So I also want to welcome and thank all the universities, the schools, the students, for dedicating their time on a Saturday. It is really a testimony of the engagement and the commitment by everybody. One of the things I wanted to point out is really the diversity that we see in representation from students, but also the universities or schools. We do have at least one HBCU and potentially one more joining soon. We have representation from the north, the south, the Midwest of the country, and all areas. We have schools with joint programs that combine a variety of disciplines, and with business. We also have students who have worked in a variety of industries, and these are not necessarily biopharma or healthcare. And I think that actually is of a nature to enrich the competition. So we all know, and Paul has alluded to that, that diversity of identity, background, experiences, expertise, and also the perspectives that we all have in the world helps accelerate innovation. And the challenge that we're posing to you with this business case, competition, is really a need for disruptive thinking and fresh ideas and solutions. I want to go back for a minute to the moral imperative that Debbie mentioned, and this comes together with a scientific imperative. I think, like anything that inspires us, great causes, we get involved because first and foremost it is the right thing to do. And then we look at some more rational aspects, and there we'll talk about the scientific imperative as well. So I think what good, I'm asking this question, what good would it be if the pharmaceutical industry and at large the life science community was coming up with innovations that are not shared with the broad representation of our communities? None of us would find that this is appropriate, and that's why it makes sense to do what we're all gathered for, which is to put together our knowledge, our expertise, our skills, try and make sure that, number one, we get representation in the clinical trials, and this, when you fast forward it, will help representation in care and treatment down the line. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that, there is the scientific imperative that patients should not be left out of clinical trials, because, it would help inform a better, balance in terms of, the benefits and the risks, because we know that diverse populations do not react to in the same way to medicines or to treatments. And so to make sure that there's a better information, scientific information, representation would help. There's also something that is not necessarily mentioned upfront, but if there is greater representation in clinical trials, and this is scientifically really demonstrated with outcomes and so forth, this will help a major component of being successful in any public health policy, which is trust. I don't want to go down the line of vaccines, skepticism, and all those things that everybody knows, but you may have the most brilliant therapies. If there's no trust, no acceptance, you're getting nowhere. So I do think that helping diversity in clinical trials will definitely help communities be a bit more, trusting of what is offered to them as solutions. And then, because this is all about patients, I wanted to share, a story which has inspired me over time. And for those interested, there's a link that you can find to a story that appeared in the New York Times back in 2016. And that is the story about Katie Jones, a patient with Hodgkin lymphoma, who actually became his own champion in terms of identifying opportunities for clinical trials for himself. So Katie, there is a bright side of the story, which is that Katie survived, from 2016 to 2022, really striving, being, upbeat and playing a role to motivate others. As an African-American, he was a good testimony of the difficulty to not only identify the right trials, but to have the right mobility to be able to go where those trials were. And unfortunately, he passed away last March. And the message here, far from being discouraging, it is to the contrary, motivation that there's more to do for patients. And I guess this is one of the reasons that we're gathered together here. So I want also to point out the need to be coordinated. There are a lot of players out there. One of the beautiful things that BioNJ is doing is that they're pulling us together. And, I'm really thrilled to have not only peers, but also, experts from a variety of horizons. And also we have in our approach, the aim to pull in representatives from government at New Jersey level and benchmarking, throughout the country beyond New Jersey and so forth. So I really want to thank once again BioNJ and everyone who is helping us have this coordinated action. I just want to close by, raising once again the urgency of us joining hands. There might be the argument by some that we already know what needs to be done to improve diversity in clinical trials. And I would argue that we only know what we know. We probably don't know what we don't know. And I would say that, we're so far from the mark in general that we cannot shut the door to innovation and to ways to either do things differently or to accelerate those things. And so by saying those few words, I have actually articulated really the expectation that we have of all participants to the MBA competition. We're expecting not less than great things from you guys. And so we're all ready, fasten our seatbelts to be impressed. And we are looking forward to the outcome of this competition. I think, thinking creatively beyond what is being done will help by and large, the approaches, that we are all having in the R&D community. And, I don't know of one company represented here that doesn't have an initiative for diversity in clinical trials. So it's not that things are not existing, it's just that we need a fantastic booster, to help us get there. Let's recognize that this is a journey, so it's not going to be a quick fix. However, the journey is better done. There's a proverb which says, if you want to go fast, go it alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that we're here today to go together. So I will turn it back to you, Debbie, because there's a lot to cover today. But I hope to have conveyed the sense of urgency and the enthusiasm that we all have to have you here today. All right, Debbie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Amadou. And for my next introduction of you, I'm going to have to add inspirational. So I hope you are all inspired by that. Such a compelling need here. And thank you for Amadou for outlining that and for everything that you do for BioNJ, the industry, and most importantly for patients all year round.
Thank you.
Sure. So we're going to dive right into the program now. And as we hear from our speakers, we invite you to type your questions into the chat box. We will get to as many of them as possible. We hope that you will be engaged throughout the process. Anything we can do to make your engagement more fun, frankly, and as well as successful, we want to do that. So to give an overview of the challenges that innovators face and our responsibility to patients, I'd ask you to please welcome a member of BioNJ's steering committee, Chris Benko. Chris is the CEO of Kineska Health, a leading patient-centric digital biomarker company. He was formerly vice president at Merck, working with its Global Health Innovation Venture Fund. So Chris brings a wealth of experience at a large global company and startups as well. Chris, I can't wait to hear from you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And thank you, Amadou. It's awesome to get the opportunity to follow you. Everybody hearing me okay? Quick thumbs up. Cool. I'm really excited to be speaking with all of you, and I'm thrilled that you're taking the time to participate and enrich your MBA experience by being a part of this program. frightens me to realize it's been 15 years since I was in business school. So when I have the opportunity to get back and connect with that experience, it's always really energizing. As Debbie mentioned, I have an array of experience. So I started my career as an 18-year-old undergraduate intern at Merck. I left 20 years later as a corporate vice president. I'll tell you a little bit more about my career there later. But for the last 8 years or so, I have been running an early stage company that I had the opportunity to launch with the support of Merck's venture fund. And we focus on building digital measurement tools, primarily for the pharma industry and clinical studies. I want to start out by sharing with you what I think is one of the most exciting, successful examples of improving diversity in a clinical study in recent memory and why it's economically important to the people who invested in it. Unfortunately, I'm going to paste this article into the chat, and I realized too late this morning that it's behind a paywall, but perhaps one of us, I'll aim afterward to track down the author and see if I can get permission to get a copy. But a few of you might read Endpoints News, which is a trade magazine that covers what happens in the pharma industry. But many more of you have probably followed the story in the last year or two of the race to get Alzheimer's drugs to patients. And those of you that have been in and around the pharma industry for a while know that many of the major pharmaceutical companies, nearly half a dozen, failed developing drugs that were meant to clear beta amyloid plaques from people's brains, which we believe are implicated in the cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's and other dementias. About 2 years ago, Biogen was granted approval unexpectedly by the FDA to bring a product to market that had shown some hints of efficacy. Very controversial approval because they were hints, not conclusive evidence in the traditional sense that the drug was working. But there was such a strong desire to give hope to patients in this area that the drug was approved and then subsequently performed incredibly poorly. It was priced very expensively initially at $50,000 a year for a therapy that we didn't know was going to have a lot of benefit. The price was later cut in half, but nonetheless, the estimates for this drug actually reaching patients have dwindled to exceptionally low. Last month, we had unbelievably exciting news, which is that another drug in the same class called lecanemab from Eisai looks like it was in fact quite successful in a phase 3 study. And it achieved its primary endpoints, including demonstrating evidence that it could actually slow the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's patients. Incredibly exciting, although admittedly, when held up against the backdrop of many, many large studies that have failed, we should all still be cautious before we declare victory in the war against Alzheimer's. But what was so exciting to me in this example and so impactful, I think, for Eisai and their business is that the clinical trial that Eisai enrolled had about 25 or 27% of its patients from the US Black and Latino communities. The Biogen study for Aduhelm was nearly all white. Why is this so important? Well, of course, it's scientifically important because it represents greater diversity, but economically, it's really important because people that get Alzheimer's drugs are going to have those drugs reimbursed by CMS, the Center for Medicare Services. And in fact, the pool of patients that CMS serves is about 25% Black or Latino in the United States. And so CMS, which is the largest purchaser of medicines in the world, and the largest customer for most pharmaceutical companies, although it depends on how much they serve older patients versus a broader population, they're a very, very, very important buyer. And when they say we want to see data from patients that look like the patients that we pay to serve, that is what pharmaceutical companies should aspire to do. And kudos to Eisai for getting it done. I don't know how they did, but I can assure you they are going to be far more successful commercially, partially because they'll price the drug the right way, but more importantly, because they can represent that they have evidence that will really carry on to the patients that we need to serve. Now, I wish I understood exactly what they did to accomplish this, but I'd like to talk with all of you a little bit today about how challenging it can be to innovate, to expand the aperture of who participates in clinical programs. Race and ethnicity are obviously huge barriers in the United States in particular, and in varying flavors in different countries around the world. Now, the dirty little secret of the pharmaceutical industry is that the entire clinical development process is predicated upon a very small population that is in fact quite diverse, sometimes referred to informally in the industry as professional patients. All drugs that go into clinical development start with human safety studies. And outside of oncology, those studies are usually done in healthy volunteers. Those healthy volunteers tend to actually be quite diverse from a racial and ethnic standpoint, not always in terms of gender. They skew more men than women. Socioeconomically, however, It's primarily folks who are disadvantaged, often unsheltered, and that's bolstered only by the presence of medical students who happen to be a very convenient audience for a lot of phase 1 facilities to recruit into their studies, and actually tend to be better informed about the risks that they're taking. Many of these patients participate in safety studies over and over again because they are well compensated for doing that. And friends and colleagues of mine who are deeply knowledgeable about the expanse of clinical trials and the challenge across scale through phase 3 will argue that these economic incentives and barriers are something that need a lot more attention. And in fact, there's not necessarily a compelling ethical argument why we cannot use cost and reimbursement as a mechanism in our later phase studies to ease the access of patients into studies. But I want to pause and note that economic barriers and racial disparities are one obvious example where we need to pay attention, and there are many other opportunities. And I look forward to hearing the creative solutions from the group about places that you identify where we could improve the representation in clinical studies. Just to give a couple other quick examples, although I mentioned early phase studies do a better job than other studies of being racially and ethnically diverse, they don't do a great job capturing the needs of older Americans. And older Americans, of course, if we're focused on the US market for a moment, but the aging population around the world is, of course, a very important population to serve with new medicines. And so because we tend to study medicines for safety in populations that are easier to work with, that means that we're primarily studying them in younger people whose bodies in many ways don't represent or function like folks who are older, who might have more diseases and might be taking more medicines. Paul and I have a friend and colleague at FDA named Chi Liu, who recently published a great paper on the importance of expanding the way we evaluate drugs in older adults. I'm also going to paste that into the chat. A few other quick examples to touch on. Pregnant people remain vastly underrepresented in clinical studies. Of course, there's a lot of concern about the risk posed to pregnant people, but the reality is pregnant people exist all the time across many different disease spectrums, and we don't get around to actually studying the impact on pregnant folks of drugs until we either do very large studies where it becomes inevitable, like the vaccine studies, where you can tell people you don't want them to get pregnant, but in a big enough population, you're going to see that happen a lot. Or we very, very carefully, studiously get to pregnant folks after we've studied in many other populations. The same is true of children. Children, despite efforts by the FDA and others to encourage children to be included, not excluded from clinical studies, nonetheless are still underrepresented in many studies where they could benefit. So how do we get past some of these barriers? I work in a technology company, and so what we do, or a technology-enabled company, we take digital health tools, so sensors, wearables, apps that can be used to create health data, and then we use them to build what are called digital biomarkers. So our digital biomarkers take data or information from sensors or technology, but we actually have to do clinical studies in human beings that show that we can measure something about how a drug is interacting with the body, or how the body is changing because of the course of a disease. So those are clinical trials that we do in healthy patients, and then we also do them in patients who have diseases or when we're studying new medicines using these technologies. It's very tempting, and I see it often, having been in the world of startup companies for the last nearly 10 years, to fantasize about how technology can solve really important, hard social problems. And it's usually not the solution in and of itself. What I have learned in the process of working through technology-enabled solutions is that the single most important thing that we can do to figure out how to make them impactful is to engage very directly with the patients and communities that we'd like to be using them. Let me draw a quick example from my Merck days, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what I've learned at Connexa and what I've seen friends learn at other innovative companies. So when I was at Merck, there was a period of time when we had one of the more important agents that was associated with treating and hopefully curing hepatitis C. Many of you may know that in the last decade, advancements in therapeutics, primarily those that have been driven by our colleagues at Gilead, have made hepatitis C a curable disease and have cured many, many, many patients around the world of this disease, which ultimately will lead to the need for a liver transplant, or in many cases leads to death due to liver failure. Our subsidiary in India wanted to reach patients in poor villages, and they came up with what they thought was a really novel idea to increase access, which was microloans and microfinancing to help people pay for these therapies. So they went into the communities and they propagated and advertised the ability to do microfinancing. And they sent folks out to try to recruit people with hepatitis C and convince them that they should get access to this therapy. And they weren't very successful at first. Then they decided to engage with folks who were more embedded within these local communities. So trusted advisors with a level of health education, but more deeply connected to the specific groups they were trying to influence and impact. In some cases, they could find these individuals. In other cases, they invested in the medical and health education for trusted community leaders. And these leaders, typically women in this community, would spend 30 or 45 minutes helping patients understand what hepatitis C was, what it was doing to their body, and what the consequences were. Because it wasn't something the patients had a deep understanding or awareness of. And what they found is that they were then tremendously successful in a conversion rate of getting patients on therapy. But the most fascinating part was that I believe no more than about 50% chose to take advantage of the microfinancing option. What the majority or nearly majority did was they went back to their families and they found ways to pay for the medicine by themselves. The point being, our original hypothesis that getting access to financial support to be able to take the drug was actually a limited part of the problem. The much more significant issue was helping people understand what the disease was doing to them and having them hear it from a trusted resource who they would believe, who helped them appreciate or understand why they would commit to a different health behavior. So the solution was much more in the conversation, not in the dollars, not in the technology. And it's important for all of us to recognize how deeply embedded the issues around trust are in the medical community around the world. If you're talking about treating African-American or Black people in the United States who are older, who are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and candidates to have common diseases, they grew up in a time when experiments happened to people potentially that they knew could have happened to them or their families that were sanctioned by the United States government. I was shocked when I was at Merck and responsible for diversity and inclusion as one of the functions in global talent. I was spending time with the former chief diversity officer of IBM, Ted Childs. And Ted, a Black man from the Boston area, said to me, "Chris, I want you to try this among your Black friends. Ask them, those who grew up in the United States, have they ever been told by a family member, don't trust white doctors?" And I was a little uncomfortable and taken aback. And then I started doing that experiment. And sometimes it came with an awkward laugh, and sometimes people said, "Oh yeah, of course." That's a pretty commonly held sentiment that people grew up around in the Black community in the United States. If you look at even recent history in the Middle East, our own government sponsored experiments that were ostensibly designed to get polio vaccines to Pakistani children. But in fact, we used those same medical experiments to collect DNA samples to try to identify whether or not there were children of Osama bin Laden living in various regions where we were trying to target him, and ultimately successful at targeting him for assassination by our government. That's a New York Times story that's relatively easy to find and well documented. My point being, there are very legitimate reasons for marginalized communities not to trust medical professionals that come in. I wish that wasn't true. I wish I could stand up and say that everything that we were doing medically and scientifically around the world was ethical and honorable, but people in marginalized communities know very well that that's not true. And so speaking to those who are trusted in those communities is incredibly important to what we're trying to accomplish. At Connexa, when we started out figuring out how we would get people to use technology, we were very interested in folks with diabetes. So we did a very simple experiment. When I say experiment, research project, didn't require an IRB. We went on Craigslist and we asked people with type 2 diabetes if they were willing to use a connected glucometer to come into our office and talk to us. And what we realized is that the complexion of diversity of people who have type 2 diabetes was far different than what we assumed, both in terms of body type, race, ethnicity, economics. And these folks had a wide range of interactions and experiences with how they wanted to use technology or whether or not they would use technology. Their relationship with whether or not they felt treating or managing this disease was something they were publicly comfortable acknowledging was widely varied. Understanding whether or not somebody needed to ask a child, their own kid, "Hey, how do I download an app to my phone?" would be a barrier for some patients. And yet we had other patients who were incredibly sophisticated with technology. So we learned very early on to repeat these kinds of experiments where we start out by talking to the people that we want to reach and talking to them very practically about how they want to use and interface with the tools and how they think about the disease they're trying to manage. My friend Monica Chowdhury started a company called Adira. and they work on improving health access through technology. And one of their most successful programs is very, very simple. They help the New York Department of Health extend its access to women who are young or expecting parents in economic need, who would be eligible for things like the Women in the WIC program, the programs that are designed to provide nutritional and health access to mothers, and specifically targeting folks who might be undocumented in this country and nervous about accessing health resources. They invest very, very heavily. Monica's partner, Anna, who's been a great advisor to us, is a user interface, user experience expert. And so they build their tools by going out and spending time with the target populations, and figured out that a chat bot that also can enable text conversations was the most effective way they could reach women in this target demographic. And they vastly increased the conversion rate of initial contacts from this site to individuals that are actually now signed up and receiving benefits, nutritional or other health benefits that they would be eligible for. So let me wrap this up so that there's a few minutes for questions. I want to tie back to my first point. I had the opportunity to lead global talent at Merck, which meant I was responsible for the diversity and inclusion function and representing it to our executive committee. Our executive committee had 4 African-American leaders on it. And during most of the time I was there, one of them was the CEO. So I think it's fair to say they were probably a more welcoming audience than most boardrooms in pharma or the industry around the general topic of diversity. But I will tell you that when it comes to convincing executives that they should sign up for something, to be held accountable, to be paid on results, on things like whether or not they change the representation of their entire workforce or their clinical trials, that is still a very, very hard conversation, even when you have an exceptionally friendly audience to the topic that's motivated and cares. To create sustainable solutions around diversity and inclusion, we need to understand what the economic case is and how it runs up against current incentive structures. So if the current incentive structures are favoring our initiative, for example, CMS saying we only want to pay for drugs that are studied in patients that look like the ones that we serve, that's to your advantage. However, if we're arguing that an initiative should be done because we believe it's the right thing to do, and it runs up against the incentives of people that ultimately make the decisions required to support it, it's going to be hard for that to be a sustainable innovation. So I encourage all of you to think about within your initiatives, what are those external forces that are going to move support in your direction? And what are the other ones that are blowing in your face? And how do we understand them and figure out how to navigate around them? Okay. Thank you very much. I think I've filled up the 20 minutes. Debbie, I don't know if we have any time for questions or if we need to move on to the next speaker.
I'm not seeing any questions at this moment. Just maybe we'll pause for another 10 seconds in case anyone has one. Okay. You can, we have a thank you, Chris. Thank you for sharing these examples. For the case, is our scope global or US based? That's a great question. Maybe Paul, that would be to you.
Ultimately, of course, the biotech industry serves a global community, but for the purposes of this competition, I think we're US based, first, of course, hoping that these solutions and programs that you bring together can be scaled to a global environment. But that's going to be, as Chris said, going to depend on all of these local environments. I thought you raised a fantastic point about cultural humility and really working hard to understand how those communities experience interactions with the healthcare systems and how they view their own healthcare journeys and conditions. And that does indeed vary over time.
Terrific. And again, great question. Thank you for that. And thank you so much, Chris. And I have to apologize to you, Chris, and to our audience because I mispronounced the name of your company when I introduced you. And I said Kineska Health. It is actually Connexa Health. So everyone, please make a note of that, and I will do the same. So
Debbie, no worries. We didn't do our own good groundwork and research when we named the company, because that's a very, very common error. Where we've changed the color of the logo to try to make the next letter a little more prominent, but you're only about the 3,000th person to do that. But you're
well, thank you for making me feel better. I appreciate that. And again, well done. Thank you. So next, I'm excited to introduce our panel of experts to discuss clinical trials and health equity pain points. To lead the discussion, I'd like to welcome Senior Associate at Hogan Level, Sarah Thompson-Schick. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. We've got about 35 minutes for this panel, so just going to dive in and introduce my fellow panelists this morning. We've got Quintus Nguma, who is the Vice President and Head of Early Clinical Development at PTC Therapeutics. Patty Doikos, who's the Executive Director for Global Health and Health Equity at Bristol Myers Squibb, and Irfan Khan, who is the founder and CEO of Circuit Clinical. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to having a great discussion about some of the pain points with respect to achieving diverse representation in clinical trials. And this is a matter of what the pain points are, but also thinking about how with respect to finding solutions and finding the best solutions, which hopefully many of you will be able to help us think through and find through this competition. But turning it over to the panelists, Quintus, Patty, Irfan, if you would like to talk through a little bit more about some of the pain points that you all see with respect to achieving diverse representation in clinical trials, whether it's how studies are designed, thinking about how research is funded, feel free to talk through that and share with the audience thoughts you have there.
Thanks, Sarah. This is really wonderful. And Chris, thanks. This is a great segue in terms of what you had said earlier. I want to start by taking a step back and talking about two terms that are often used interchangeably, but don't mean the same thing. And that's drug efficacy and drug effectiveness. And a lot of times when we talk about inclusion and diversity, we think about it just benefiting the population of patients, right? But it also benefits the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical company that's developing the drug. So in a clinical trial, there are a lot of controls that are put in place. And a lot of these controls are modulated through what we call inclusion exclusion criteria. You want to pick the right population of patients and be able to sort of provide the right environment to test your drug and see whether it's efficacious or not. But when you get into the real world after approval, a lot of times you find out that the efficacy that you found in your clinical trial may not be replicated in the real world. And really, it's the ability of the drug to produce some outcome in the real world is what is called effectiveness. So these are two different things. So if you have a clinical trial that is not very diverse in terms of the different groups of peoples that are included, what you may find out is that it may not be truly representative of what you find in the real world. And this is what happens to some drugs that may actually, be efficacious in a clinical trial, but in the real world, you find out that they're not very, very effective. Now, going back to some of the pain points, one of the challenges that I find working in the rare genetic, disease space is that by virtue of a lot of these diseases being, inherited, you find that you have very small populations that may be heterogeneous in terms of their presentation of these diseases, but it may affect a certain race predominantly. It may affect a certain gender predominantly. And so you find it's sometimes very difficult, right? And what I've also found out is that in these very small populations, access to information sometimes becomes very critical. If you don't know, right, you don't know. And there's also some socioeconomic implication to it. A lot of the people that are better off tend to have greater access to information, and therefore they will be able to find the centers of excellence, that treat some of these diseases. And for those that are in pharma, most times you approach the centers of excellence. And so people that don't have access to the centers of excellence may be excluded rather in the clinical trials.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. That's a really comprehensive way of laying it out. I think so. We work at Circuit. We work more from the site side. Like, can we put research into doctors' offices that a more diverse group of patients actually get their care at? And in doing that work, what you see a lot is that I think it always starts with value, right? So do communities of color see value in clinical research? And so sometimes you'll hear this sort of said that, well, there's these legacy trust issues. And I always like that framing because it lets us off the hook, right? If you if you want to read the Tuskegee syphilis experiments Wikipedia page, you will have to remember the entire time you're reading about these doctors, these are some of the luminaries of public health at the time. These are top of the food chain in terms of command and control in American health. And the experiments is just about as horrific as you've been led to believe. And so, and that's really just one example. There's a great book that will give you a perspective on kind of what might be going through the minds of somebody who's heard any of these stories, called Medical Apartheid, and it talks about really, more than a century's worth of experimentation without context and without buy-in, really, both from the individual patient and the communities that these patients are being sourced from to participate. So, the phrase I always use is, yes, I can tolerate the phrase, legacy trust issues, if we insert some stuff in the middle, which is really like, with excellent historical reasoning, there are these legacy issues. And so if we're thinking about the problem of what could you do to improve participation in clinical research, I think it starts with first asking ourselves, why is research valuable? Why do we all feel it's valuable? And how would we explain that to somebody who said, well, how do I know you're not just, experimenting on me in the same way that I was, people like me have been experimented on in the past? That's a tricky conversation. I mean, that's really takes a lot of, willingness to be vulnerable and really have that conversation. So it starts with value, I think, is the first piece. The second piece is the access points are very, very, very choked off right now. The way to think about drug development in the United States is that 200 of the 80,000 zip codes we have in the US, so just 200 of them do half the research in the country. So there's really no way that could be an equitable setup. And truthfully, I'm talking about everybody on this call. If your physician isn't a principal investigator in the trial you need, your access to research is nominal at best. Your ability to find a trial is going to be dependent on how health literate you are, and on how health levered you are. In other words, how many doctors do you know who might be able to point you in the right direction, or have a friend at Case Western or at Harvard who's doing exactly this stuff? It's a uphill climb for almost everybody who ends up in clinical research, unless they accidentally happen to be in that tertiary care center where the opportunity can happen. So if that's the situation, it's very similar to thinking about a network that's absolutely at capacity. So if we think about the academic medical centers where research happens in the country, and we think about the private brick and mortar research sites and those little networks of sites, that represents, essentially, you can think of it like telephone poles and a landline. And the way you would change that challenge maybe isn't so much just knock down the telephone poles, but it's to put up a different kind of network beside it. And that's a lot of the work you see happening from companies that think that there could be new ways to engage this. The part that's getting missed is that if we don't carefully pick what those new access points are, we could accidentally reproduce the exact same problem. Whether we're using technology to make visits happen for people at home, if we don't take into account what those other barriers are with technology that do asymmetrically affect communities of color, we just propagate the problem. We've moved the trial to the house, or we've moved the trial to the doctor's office, but the doctors we picked weren't particularly diverse, and they didn't serve particularly diverse communities. And the technologies we used are distributed to people that already are not only technology capable, they have everything they need, they know what this is, they like it, and they want to be receiving their visit at home via teleresearch. So there's a series of things to unpack, but I think it really, from the way we look at this, is it starts with two problems. One is, can we adequately determine if there is value for this particular person in clinical research? Can we communicate that value? And then secondly, what context are we communicating that value? Those are some of the key challenges, I think, as we think about what could a better version of all this look like.
And I so appreciate that value, emphasis on value, just really standing in the shoes of the patient who is underserved, who hasn't had an opportunity, and understanding their perspective of what is the value to me, what is the value to my community, rather than what is the value to science broadly, or as the NASEM study showed, that many patients believe that this is for a population, for the white population, or for the institution itself. You don't have an investment in me and my community and their well-being. So appreciate you bringing that forward. I've been asked to think a little bit about more on the individual, the patient level, and the community level. In addition to the trust issue, patients are just not asked to participate. And this is where unconscious bias comes into play, including, as I've heard from numerous patients, and even some of our colleagues at BMS, there's an over-indexing on Tuskegee and the history of clinical trials and abuses in medical research, when rather than having a conversation about it and really creating a dialogue there, as well as understanding of the patient protections that have been subsequently put in place so that Tuskegee never happens again. So this is really important to share with patients. I think also just in terms of the patient level, challenges are money, time, and opportunity. There are costs and very many competing priorities when we look at populations that are not represented as heavily, like women and lower income people who have caregiving and challenges, may have jobs where they're place-based jobs where they need to be there so much that it's difficult to come to the clinic during its hours. They're concerned about loss of wages. So they're making these trade-offs between many other competing needs that they have, but also opportunities that they have. You know, one thing that you might want to pay attention to is some of the things, good things that are happening that can be connected into clinical trials. So social determinants of health has become a national discussion. This idea that your zip code determines more of your health than your genetic code is sort of on the lips of many more people than it was 10 years ago. And that really goes to the social determinants of health. So the conditions in which people live, work, play, etc. And this is things like education, economic opportunity, transportation and community infrastructure. The cohesion of communities is very, very important. What kind of healthcare is available, including the opportunity to participate in clinical trials. But there is now across the nation sort of a number of layers of work on social determinants of health, including health systems and health plans as well, doing social determinants of health screens for patients so that they can understand what they might need to best participate in their care. Is there an opportunity to bring those kinds of screens and linkage to supportive services into clinical trials as part of the protocol and the approach to working with patients? The other piece, and it was so interesting to hear earlier about the India health promoters example. Though this is for the US, there are examples and tools outside the US that you might want to think about in health promoters, community health workers, promotores de salud, as they call them in Latin America, are trusted voices, folks in the community that are on an ongoing basis strengthening the community, sharing knowledge with families and community members, including in the health area. Community health workers is an evidence-based practice for closing disparities gap. President Biden just issued a national initiative to increase the number of community health workers. Can clinical trial information be brought into it, as we heard in the case in India, in a two-step process of let's talk about the disease and the treatments that are coming forward, and then see if it's something that you want to participate. So there are ways to use community health workers. Also just partnering with community groups, and I saw in the note that that there is a requirement and strong encouragement in your work to reach out to patient advocacy groups, to groups like here in New Jersey. You might take a look at Crossroads for Hope. I was just at their annual gala a couple of days ago. And one of the things that they featured at the gala was about a 3-minute cartoon video, animated video that showed really what a clinical trial is and even spoke to the value and why patients may want to consider it. And that's something that they're going to be using with their community health workers to get out and begin to emphasize the importance of clinical trials there. The other thing I think you might give thought to is that clinical trials and diversity in clinical trials has not been framed as a public health issue, and there could be an opportunity to bring it forward there. Some things that we're seeing in healthcare is bringing the clinical trial discussion forward when a patient is diagnosed, so that it is seen as part of the options that patients will have, can consider with their provider, whether they would like to participate in, so that it doesn't come once they've burned through, if this is the case of the patient, a number of lines of treatment, and trying to, with that distress, trying to make a decision about participating in clinical trials as well. And also framing clinical trials as just part of high quality care. And that's what we're aiming for. Equitable access to high quality care is sort of what underpins health equity in terms of healthcare delivery. So these are just some of the things to to think about for the pain points within the community and for patients too. The communities do want to know what the opportunities are for clinical trials, and there's just not great sustained engagement with them on the topics, on the opportunities, continuously educating them about how they work, what their value is, and how to have a discussion with their clinician about participating as well.
Great. Thank you all for that. And as we think about the what, the pain points, as we just talked about, one of the common themes that came up in this discussion is the theme of community, and also how we engage with communities. How do we think about how communities are defined? Quintus spoke briefly about centers of excellence, and I know in our prep session we talked about communities of excellence. So thinking about that as a potential concept and how communities are defined and how we gain access to those communities, and thinking about that, but also other ways in how we can find solutions for increasing diverse representation, such as moving beyond academic centers. And again, thinking about community health considerations. So why don't we talk about that a little bit more? Because I think that is probably the direction that this conversation and beyond with respect to solutions is probably headed with respect to diversity in clinical trials.
Sure, I can start with just an example. A lot of the work we do is in the federally qualified health centers and in health systems that serve fairly large and very diverse groups of patients. I'm thinking of a good example that's not too far from many of you, maybe is Riverside, New Jersey, a very diverse group of patients, both ethnically, racially diverse. And when you think about sort of those kind of those doctors choosing to do research in addition to a busy private practice, that's an interesting conversation. I think the second part of this is the federally qualified health centers represent essentially the last line of defense in American medical care. Very, very strong commitment to the Black community, the Latinx community in terms of the Hispanic community in terms of really offering services that serve these communities in the city itself. The other part of that equation is serving places that are rural and don't have access to a traditional clinical trial on-ramp. So right now, if we think about what could we do to make that work, we have to remember that that's just one small bolt-on space in that community. Are there other ways to support the conversation from happening? So some of this comes back to, we talked value and we talked context, right? So could you bring the opportunity closer to the patient? That's valuable. But how could you create a space where they could hear about clinical trials in a way that allowed them to see it differently than it's presented on the news, where maybe they've heard some terrible example, and we have a short window here, I think, that's already kind of evaporating, where the great work of the COVID-19 vaccines, which did a lot of good in preventing death and disease, I think we have a window to have different conversations about clinical trials. And I think what a lot of teams are working on right now at every level, the pharmaceutical sponsors, the contract research organizations, the site networks, everybody who tries to find patients for clinical trials, the patient recruitment companies, they're all trying to think about how could you have these conversations in a place that might be more value neutral and higher trust, essentially, I think is what this is going to come down to. So what we've seen through the COVID-19 vaccine studies was that the churches ended up being a really great place. The Black churches were a really great place to have a different conversation about the concerns, the legitimate concerns people have about a vaccine that really, came out of the blue and used new technologies. And so that ended up being a model, I think, for what the next version of clinical trial conversations could be. And are there other spaces like that that are meaningful? I'm friends with two founders who run this brilliant company that is sort of like the open table for barbershops. So I've learned more about kind of what the barbershops are really capable of when it comes to an honest conversation about pretty much everything. And so there's a group of clinical trial specialists now who are looking at maybe that's a place where patient recruitment could happen, or at least patient awareness and education. So I think as we think about the community itself, any community. You know, this could be the Pakistani community in Toronto. It could be the Black community in Buffalo, New York, where I'm from. Any of those conversations, I think, are going to have to think about where might those conversations, where might those engagements take place. And so we're seeing a lot of innovation in this space. We saw, Craig, I think it was Acclinate that won a DFARM Disrupt this year, which is a platform play for this, which I think is brilliant. And so I think there's technology solutions, but I think those technology solutions are tied to a much deeper understanding of what it means to have a good conversation in some of these spaces. So, as we think about what the purpose of today's visit, today's collection of minds today is that there's an unsolved problem here, a massive unsolved problem that goes to health equity, but it is a solvable problem. It sits in the set of solutions that these things can be solved. Some things, will we ever get peace in our time all over the world? I don't know, but could we find a way to have better conversations about clinical trials with communities of color? I am absolutely convinced we can. So that, I think, is a way to think about this: is where are the access points, both digital and physical, inside a community that you'd like to engage?
I think also just from a communications campaign, one thing I'll share with you all is that Bristol Myers Squibb partnered with Stand Up to Cancer in Common to do a campaign about it being a new day in lung cancer and creating change in lung cancer by first being aware of the risk in the African American community, particularly to men, for lung cancer, that there are new treatments available, but also new treatments are coming, and be part of the change. So really keying into, I think, incredible leadership and culture within the Black community for our nation and leading a lot of change. So really through that kind of frame, talking and sharing information about the importance of being part of creating the change was essentially Common's message by participating in clinical trials. And that campaign already has had 2.4 billion impressions, which is something we've never seen before with that. So it's the voices too that there's in the community physically, as you're saying, Irfan, with those community-based assets that have incredible trust and hard lines into the communities that we're trying to reach on, that are sustained over time and have been built up over time as well. But then there's also these sort of umbrella ways, broader ways of covering a lot of territory by leveraging trusted voices as well. And culture and community, hip hop public health has done incredible work in this space as well. So just a couple resources for you all to think about. And I'll put notes in the chat on them.
I agree with both of my colleagues on this panel. It's interesting the way Sarah took community and put it right back in the center. And I think one of the things that really identifies the community is trust, right? There has to be some level of trust among the members of that community. And one of the things that really came to mind was the example of what happened during the rollout of the COVID vaccines. There were a lot of online communities, and there was a lot of, so social platforms can be good, they can be bad, right? It's a way to rapidly disseminate information to a wide audience, but it could also be a way to spread misinformation and disinformation. And I remember that even within my company, certain individuals from other departments would call me to talk to certain people because they were hesitant to get the vaccine. And many of them were predominantly, people of color. And when I spoke with them, I found out that a lot of them belong to some online communities, right? It could be through a WhatsApp chat group. It could be through Facebook. And a lot of the information they were receiving was information that was really not true. And so I had to sit with them and sort of guide them through it. But then I was saying to myself, you're catching one fire here. Who knows how many of these online communities exist? And that is a problem, One of the ways I think you can help to sort of mitigate part of some of that risk is maybe working through patient advocacy groups, some of whom also have online presence, and who, being a community, their members would trust what they say, better than what an outsider is telling them. So that's been my, experience with that. I don't know what some of the other panelists would say in terms of their own experience regarding online communities.
I certainly know, Quintus, talking to our patient advocacy groups, they are so concerned about the misinformation and disinformation out there. And one group that we partner with, Dia de la Mujer, said then in the non-English language community, there's a whole other level of risk that is there for themselves. And they're putting so much of their work towards making sure that it's evidence-based information and helping to folks to discern between evidence-based information and not. And NASM actually just put out their first paper last year, and I'll put it in the chat as well, to start to look at all of this misinformation and its impact on public health and well-being as well. One thing I just wanted to mention, and Sarah, this is because you inspired this in our discussion, I think it's important for this group to hear, though, is about the idea of incentives to drive diversity in clinical trials. The NASM report that we shared with you does speak to that. And I know, Sarah, you've just worked on a paper, so I wonder if you might want to share that with the group in terms of, business loves incentives. So we just wanted to raise that for this group.
Sure, absolutely. Very quickly, a colleague and I wrote a paper that was recently published in the Food and Drug Law Journal on the idea of regulatory incentives that could be considered by FDA that would incentivize sponsors for increasing clinical trial diversity. And we outlined specific criteria that would follow, how that criteria would be defined. We lean on some of the ideas that are currently already available for regulatory incentives, such as some of the fast track programs under the expedited program guidance that many of us are familiar with here. We also think through how the concept of regulatory exclusivity akin to the pediatric exclusivity process could potentially work. And then we also go through a pretty detailed discussion about the economic impact of regulatory incentives and how this could really be beneficial to industry. So there's and the way that I describe this is the paper was written last year, was finally published this year. It's really an ongoing conversation. I really wish in the end we could have said to be continued ... because there's definitely more to come. So I think that there's a really ripe opportunity for the agency to have conversations, also CMS as well. We focus on FDA, but I think there's definitely some reimbursement considerations as well. So that's just very, very high level. And I don't know how much more time we have left. There was a question that I had just briefly for the panel on institutional solutions, and something that a question that's been floated recently by a number of people about how do we think about remuneration of patients as a potential incentive. So thinking not just regulatory incentives, but how we pay patients and what does that look like? It's a question that I've really struggled with myself, and whether or not it even makes sense to consider. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether that's something that could even work.
In terms of compensating patients for their time?
Yes, that's right. For participation.
I think we've gotten to the point where that's almost standard practice now in a lot of trials that we see, and I think it can be looked at through two frameworks that I think are interesting relative to how could we change diverse participation in clinical trials. So the one way of looking at it is that if we want to actually have the ability to bring a message into a community, if you think about it from the perspective of just the average everyday person who may have never been part of drug development in their life, it's going to feel a lot like, somebody shows up because they want something. They get something out of the practice or the church or wherever they are. They have their thing, and then they disappear for another 5 years until the next study is ready to go. And it can feel very transactional. And we've heard this directly from community leaders all over the country on this one. So better might be moving from a transactional relationship to a really to a relationship. Maybe from a transaction to a relationship is probably the way to think about this. And so that's really where I think, I think the direct compensation for patients is super interesting and super important. The other paradigm of that is if you don't compensate them, you're really taxing them. So you're agreeing that you'd like to be engaged in a community that already suffers from health inequities and injustices. And what you'd like is their time, and if there's not good access points to the study to be close and convenient for them, then it's not just time, it's also the difficulty of actually getting someplace that's foreign to them, in being in a care environment that's foreign to them. It creates a huge cliff, I think, of difficulty. And it's even if you could convince somebody to participate in a given trial in that model, it's hard for me to imagine why somebody would stay in that unless they were desperate for treatment and this was the only option. But that's not hopefully what we're talking about. We're talking about how could you change the context in which research is brought to communities of color in such a way that you could do a new heart failure drug. So no one's going to be at risk of dying here. Everybody's on treatment. They don't love it. They would love to feel better. And a new heart failure drug shows up. Is that person going to go through all that stuff just to get to a clinical trial? Probably not. So, and we brought a drug like that to market recently, and Entresto is a pretty good example of that. And that had to go through very complicated clinical trials. So if we would like better, I think it's got to be absolutely about patient compensation. Where I've really begun to wonder and ask questions about is there a mechanism in which there can be community engagement as part of that budget? Because that would create something less transactional, more long lasting. And maybe if it layers one program on after another, suddenly the community is seeing that, oh no, this is basically about health equity, and here's a series of commitments that are being made over time to sponsor events in the community. It's tricky because clinical trial operations budgets don't work that way currently, but I think we might be at a point where some interesting conversations can be had around this. So that's my thoughts on compensation. I think if you don't give it, it's essentially a tax on a patient and just making things harder for everybody. Patty?
Yeah, I agree with you, Irfan. And, when going back to the value, Moon Chen out at UC Davis has done some research where asking about other kinds of value for patients having participated in clinical trial. And one of the important things that came back is the patient said, I now know how to navigate healthcare. And I've now seen what it looks like to access best quality healthcare. So this is an additional value, I think, to the patient that can be a builder for the long-term relationship, is that as they've gained knowledge working with the navigator and working with the clinical research team to understand what best care looks like and what they should be pursuing for themselves and their families going forward, there's a tremendous value there for them.
Great. Thank you all so much. That's our time. And thank you, Quintus. Thank you, Irfan. Thank you, Patty. This has been a fantastic discussion. And I'm going to hand it back over to you, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and to our panel. That was just brilliant, and so inspiring. And if I were a student, I don't think I could help but be excited about creating the possibilities. And thank you to everyone who contributed anything in the chat, because that was almost as compelling as the panel. So thank you, Sarah, Irfan, Patty, and Quintus. Very much appreciate your time. And all of our speakers are on our steering committee, and they have really been instrumental in moving this initiative forward. So thank you. So next up, to review innovative approaches to enhancing representation in clinical trials, I'd like to welcome back our next panel will be led by Senior Director of Public Policy for Amicus Therapeutics, Dr. Paul Howard. So welcome, Paul, and to your panel as well.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I hope my voice is back. I think it is. That was just an amazing discussion. I'd really like to thank Sarah and her panel for setting us up in a tremendous way. I'd like our panel and my discussion with Craig and Victoria to really move into questions about what kind of specific tools and technology should our MBA teams be thinking about leveraging as they build community partnerships and outreach in specific disease settings. And the phrase that we've used throughout this competition, as we've been discussing amongst the steering committee, has been efforts that are both high tech and high touch. So we've had the experience, and this has really come to fruition during the COVID-19 pandemic, that what we call decentralized trial technologies that can include e-consent, sending a drug product that might be needed for a trial directly to a patient's house, doing remote assessments that can be conducted at home via video or via, say, a nurse that could visit the home, that protect patients from having to go into a clinical trial setting that might be in a hospital that might expose medically fragile patients to the risk of infection. And I'd like to start off with my opening question to Victoria and Craig. Could you just, talk about your perspective, how far we've come with decentralized trial tools, what are the kinds of use cases we should be thinking about, and what are the returns on investment for these tools in terms of their ability to make it easier for frontline care workers, trusted community organizations, and of course, people living with these conditions to participate in clinical trials? What kind of opportunities are out there, and what have we learned about how effective these tools are? So either Victoria or Craig, please feel free to start off that question.
Great, so maybe I'll start off, and Craig, please feel free to chime in as well. I'll just comment briefly on that impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, it has really brought about some significant changes, things that we've been trying to change in the landscape for years, happening essentially overnight, that need to suddenly shift from in-person visits to really a telemedicine approach, and really all the infrastructure that's needed to make that change. At the same time, as you've heard earlier from some of the panels this morning, changing the technology is not the same as getting patients into the space and really into those trials. And so again, that next layer of how do we also make sure not only that visits are happening, but that medications are continuing to be received, and that there's also this appropriate support operationally that's happening really across the board. So I'll pause there. Craig, over to you.
As we've been talking about all morning, there are many reasons for these challenges and barriers for people to access and participate in trials. And some of those are due to physical barriers, whether it is geographic distance, whether it is other commitments at home, such as childcare or travel costs to be able to reach a site, or simply the nature of one's work for those that are doing more shift work versus salaried. To be able to lose wages in order to participate can certainly represent a barrier. And, obviously, as we've talked about during the pandemic, when everything was taking place at home, there was this dramatic shift in the location of everything we were doing, including research participation. But this shift in using these approaches, the approaches weren't new. What they got was sunlight. What they got was adoption inside of industry-sponsored and academic clinical research. So when we think about this concept of decentralizing a clinical trial, I like to think of this as the use of both technology as well as process innovation that creates the opportunity for visits to take place outside of a traditional research site. And so this is a story of technology, as has been mentioned here, whether we're talking about video or electronic consent, or like Chris was mentioning at the outset, our ability to measure endpoints and changes in how people are feeling and functioning in better and smarter ways using technology and continuous monitoring. But this is also an important story about innovative services, about using home health and visiting nurses, about extending our supply chain so investigational medicines can reach people at home, about our ability to collect specimens, blood, and other artifacts from people outside of a traditional research site. Now, as we're seeing this shift taking place, one thing that's becoming very clear is this is not a story about studies being in a clinic versus everything happening at home, because what most people want is some optionality and flexibility in how they engage. And I think what many study teams and operators are finding is that's really hard. It's hard because we might have a lot of redundant infrastructure. It's hard because we're not good at planning which option different patients may want at different times in their journey. When we think about, the restaurant industry as an example, there's a lot of redundancy of having tables in the restaurant and a delivery guy waiting at the counter, because you don't know which way people are going to want to go. Are they going to come in and pick up takeout? Do they want to deliver? Do they want to come and dine in? And so you have a carry cost of a lot of extra infrastructure to make that work. And we'll have the same in clinical research as we're thinking about visiting nurses or video or coming into the clinic. How do we really drive scale around this. Paul, you had also called out some notes on what we're seeing for ROI. Should I pull you in that direction?
Please do. Please do.
Great. So the original value proposition for why decentralized had always been very patient factor oriented, right? This was a story about how might we improve recruitment and retention? How might we improve access and experience? How might we improve representation? And I think during the pandemic, some of that value proposition started to expand a bit because we started to see value in just business continuity and resilience. How do we keep these studies running where there are people depending on access to these new medicines? How do we keep these studies running in an unpredictable environment? And I think even now we're starting to see yet another value driver adjacent to the patient factors, adjacent to the business continuity. We're seeing this question of environmental sustainability. And as more and more enterprises have goals related to ESG, of environmental and social and governance, how might decentralized trials help contribute to a lower carbon footprint for how we're running our research studies? But the earliest data that we're actually starting to see around business impact has leaned in around ROI and other measures like a net present value calculation, trying to estimate the quantitative impact of these investments, because that's really what they are. Study teams have to buy in to paying a little more upfront with the hope that there's going to be something good that comes out the other side. Adding video, adding electronic tools, adding visiting nurses is all adding. And so we have to have the belief that there's going to be some business rationale, something quantitative we can show. And some of the early data is showing that. There's a large CRO, IQVIA, that started to show some data based on their work in this field, which was showing a significant 49% reduction to the time of getting patients into trials, showing a reduction in overall recruitment time, showing a reduction in dropout rates and screen failure rates, which means patients who are trying to get into the study but prove not to be able to participate. But importantly, Tufts University has started to publish some data that compared 150 conventional trials to around 50 studies that use decentralized approaches, and looked at the cost for those studies in terms of total contract values, and then factored that into a net present value calculation, trying to estimate, based on the savings in time and other attributes, what was the overall benefit of this investment for that medicine's lifetime, in terms of maybe how much additional revenue could have been captured by saving time. So what Tufts found was that for the studies that were using decentralized approaches, there was roughly a 5 to 10% cycle time improvement, and that when they took the amount of the additional investment required to use those tools, it was coming out at about a 13x ROI for a typical phase 3 study, which sounds incredibly ambitious. I think if it's a fraction of that, that's a pretty good number. So we'll see how these numbers stick and evolve over the next few years. But certainly the initial data that we're starting to see is certainly pointing the right direction.
It's great
And-
that you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Victoria.
Yeah, I think when you raise these components of what does the initial data look like? What does that cost look like? I think building off of that link to Amadou's earlier point around doing the right thing, there's so much that we want to do as far as the moral as well as scientific imperative. At the same time, it's a highly regulated environment, and there's a lot of right things that we need to do in order to ensure that it remains at the highest possible quality, or that it remains at the highest possible components that would meet legal compliance. And some of these elements, I think, have also come into the forefront when it comes to the potential for collaborations. Can we collaborate synergistically with representatives from regulatory, from government authorities, in order to make sure that we're continuing to do the right thing, as well as advance science in the best possible way?
Victoria, I think that's such an important point, because look, there are a lot of right things for teams to do, and they try to do as many of the right things that they possibly can, but there's only so far that they can stretch any given dollar. And so being able to bundle financial impact, other performance impact with something that is a right thing to do can be a great win for just sustainability in driving commitments in these changing in these new approaches. And fortunately, we're certainly seeing a lot of signals around organizations committing in so many of these areas, hiring committed resources focused on diversity and inclusion, embedding new processes and new partners in their organization to decentralize trials and improve access, having dedicated groups focused on digital medicine to truly own that modernization of how we're measuring things in our studies.
That's incredibly helpful. I wanted to kind of pull that thought through to the issue that Sarah referenced and her great paper that she also has dropped into the chat. There really is a potential synergy here between our ability to develop high-touch solutions that are trusted, that are delivered to the community level, and regulatory incentives that can be available to encourage sponsors to invest in these solutions and then develop them. And it's a potential win-win for the entire community and for sponsors, because through tools, and I'd love for you, Victoria, to think about this or talk about this in terms of what we've seen, particularly in the oncology space, as oncology has become really a search for particular subgroups of cancer patients that are defined molecularly in terms of a biomarker. EHRs and other tools can be a way to identify patients who might be amenable to participate in a clinical trial. How do we use those platforms and think about how to interact with patients wherever they may access care, depending on your type of insurance? That might be an FQHC, it might be an emergency room, it might be more episodic, but we can also find patients through non-traditional means. What is the thinking at AstraZeneca and the cancer community broadly about how to harness these tools in service of building more diverse and representative clinical trials?
It's a great question there, Paul. And we do have a recent publication, AstraZeneca in partnership with the Food and Drug Administration, that's come out specifically around what are the learnings from the pandemic. And some of the key changes that I can comment on from AstraZeneca studies in that industry perspective were really related to key changes related to electronic virtual consents. So do we have to have a patient travel all this way to risk potential exposure? Are there other abilities for us to reduce some of these on-site requirements? So do patients have to travel all this way for a single visit to get a blood draw, or can they get that done at home or locally? And again, in a safe way and still have that contribute to the ultimate data. Are there ways for us to make sure that patients can receive a drug safely at home and then continue on their therapy instead of having to pause? And again, given how tightly regulated this environment is, as you alluded to, Paul, wanting to do that right thing and make sure that we're still following all those components, lots of good conversations about where are those opportunities for digital health technologies, say in remote pulse collection or blood pressure monitoring or EKGs, where that can be done in an electronic fashion. The same with that patient-reported outcome data, where that's coming directly from the patients. And with that link to FDA and regulatory, I think the FDA did initially come out with a very helpful guidance for industry investigators and IRBs with the pandemic. At the same time, there is that room for interpretation of how we implement that change. How do we ensure what that looks like? And ultimately, it's led to a lot of really productive conversations with patient advocacy organizations, a number of cancer societies, and a number of cross-industry clinical trial sponsors to really determine, is this working? And also, what can we keep now that the pandemic is potentially turning a corner to really change the way that we conduct cancer trials in the future?
That's terrific. Craig, I wanted to ask you about the role of, what we might think of as non-traditional clinical trial sites. Some, whether it's a pharmacy or another site, where do you see those opportunities to, as I said before, bring the clinical trial ecosystem closer to where patients live and work, and also where they routinely receive care by caregivers who they might feel less intimidated by or easier to relate to than potentially a traditional physician environment, where we all know that physician might have 5 minutes or 10 minutes to talk to you before they're moving on to the next patient. What do you see as the frontier places where we can extend opportunities to engage in research and educate patients about opportunities to participate?
Great question, Paul. You know, during the pandemic, certainly the two extremes were everything in the home or everything at the research site. And now we're really seeing a far more expansive view of where can a research encounter take place. And so for those that follow the space, you see the entrance of retail with CVS, Walmart, Walgreens, all announcing entrances and capabilities that they're working to build around supporting research study participation. We see companies that are launching fleets of mobile units to be able to roll a research site onto the corner of your local neighborhood. We see other models like Irfan was mentioning earlier, such as partnering with federally qualified health centers in communities to help activate them to be research sites. You know, the big question I think with many of these retail players will be, are they sites themselves, or are they trying to provide just an additional outpost or location for some other research site, wherever that may be? But so much of this links back to that last question you were raising around the economic incentives here. And I think this is a great footnote for our colleagues from the business programs that are engaging with us. Focus on the freakonomics of clinical research, where we have misaligned economic incentives, because even the best of intentions sometimes fail if we don't really think through the incentives for the different operators. We talked earlier about incentives for pharma that could come from legislators, whether carrots or sticks coming through different pieces of policy that might penalize those for lack of representation. Of course, to a pharma team, the ultimate stick is a regulatory refusal. And so there is a fear of using new approaches because of that. But think about, you know, the economic incentives of research sites. What perceptions will they have if they're splitting revenue with a visiting nurse service or with CVS when they're already operating on such a thin margin as a research site? How do we keep them whole? Think about the treating physicians in the local community who aren't involved in research, and how leaking patients is viewed as an extreme negative inside of most health systems today. There's not a lot of motivation to just send your patients away to others. How might decentralized approaches let some of those encounters happen in your own doctor's office? And as Irfan and others were mentioning in the last session, what are the incentives we could provide for patients and in a legal and ethical way when they're providing something of value, whether their time or their data, to support research?
Craig, I think I'm going to steal that title, The Freakonomics of Clinical Trial Research. That's amazing. That would be a terrific title for a paper or a webinar. Maybe we should spin that off. I think one of the interesting subthreads we've been talking about here, and I'd be interested to know either of your thoughts, is the increase we need to have on the user experience. That is the patient, the support systems experience of participating in clinical trials, that goes to both touch and accessibility. But at the same time, are there any other lessons learned, do you think we can borrow from other industries that give a lot more time about the patient experience? And by the way, this is a leading issue for the US Food and Drug Administration, for the FDA, that has created, I think, since 2012, a patient-focused drug development program where the FDA really prioritizes the patient voice about what they experience, how a change in state feels to them, how is it valued by them, and how some of these new tools that you're talking about can be used to enhance the patient experience, enhance the sponsor's understanding of the disease state, reach patients more efficiently. And as you said, Craig, a lot of trial sites, because they are too fragmented, too clunky, too bureaucratic, there's too much burden associated and imposed on patients who have to travel to those sites. You see a lot of dropout, and it's probably 3 to 4 times as expensive to get a new patient as it is to keep one in a trial. But do either of you have any thoughts about what we can do to improve that patient experience? What we can learn from other, maybe non-traditional sources about how to improve experience? Or maybe that's really the voice we need to have from our patient advocacy partners, our community partners, because they're the ones who are closest to those communities and can give us a sense of what the real user experience is and where those communities really turn to for information. That might vary by age. Maybe it's Instagram, maybe it's TikTok, maybe it's something else, but we need to be really aware of how fine-grained those sources can be.
Paul, user experience isn't guesswork, right? There is an art and a science to user experience. I know it was just dropped by Kim in the or by Sam that stay tuned after the break for Dr. Washington from Verily. But I'll tell you, when I was at Pfizer and we were doing some project work at Verily, their number of colleagues owning user experience was probably twice as many as the entire pharma industry had in that role, thinking about user experience in clinical research. And so there are and these are people that didn't just make it as a hobby. They have degrees that focused on user experience and design. There are clearly things we need to adapt and learn from. When we look at our health system partners, they'll have centers that are focused on human factors and other attributes. We can do more with real world simulations, testing our studies in real world environments to be able to learn with patients and investigators what's working and what's not, to capture those data and insights in a more consistent way, and to take advantage of, as you're hinting at, the best practices that exist from outside of clinical research today.
Building off of that, I think this discussion around incentives, this discussion around doing the right thing, we've listed so many factors today in this panel as well as previous panels, where I think that push becomes an important one for design, and really thinking about how that changes perhaps our future designs compared to perhaps historical designs that may not have considered all these components per se proactively to look for ensuring that we would have enough diversity in the population. And so I think bringing that to the forefront and then leveraging our great teams today to think about where can we ensure that that conversation is happening in the design phase? Who needs to be at the table at the design phase? Are they patients? Are they advocacy groups? Who's the appropriate representative to truly represent that voice? Is one person to represent an entire group the appropriate path, or is there another way that we would need in order to ensure true representation, not only from a diversity and inclusion perspective, whether that's age, race, ethnicity, military experience, or other statuses, but also thinking about what that means when it comes to that scientific implementation as well as scientific implications clinically and in patient experiences of the drug, as well as patient experiences of the trial.
That's fantastic, Victoria. Thank you. And for those on the teams who might be in the data science field or the informatics field, as Victoria alluded to, there's a lot of ongoing work now, both to think about how to use real world data to augment traditional clinical trial design, so that we can have a better understanding of how some of these external factors like health status or functional status of patients might impact the trial, but that might allow you to still have a smaller trial, but bring in more diverse elements to expand your understanding of the trial so that you can generate more information about how that product, that real world effectiveness that Amadou spoke about earlier, is going to ultimately impact outcomes. And that should be highly valued information, I hope, with our payer partners, with CMS and others. And it does take everyone to come to the table and value that information. There's also lots of work that's ongoing that's really exciting around the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to help identify patients in medical records who might be experiencing a medical odyssey, and to be able to identify a potential diagnosis for that patient, whether it's through a genetic test or some other type of test that might involve a consultation with a specialist. But we need to move those tools and validate them closer to where patients are actually experiencing care in the community. That might be a Medicaid program, that might be some other program that hinges on the analysis of, say, claims data or pharmacy data to augment our understanding, so we can find patients who are most eligible for clinical trials or who could benefit from that opportunity. I think I'd want to close out with one last question. I know we've got about 5 minutes left in this discussion. What kind of advice would you give to the teams about thinking about the design of technology into a potential clinical trial program, and best cases that you've come across for trust and working with community partners? We've heard a lot of discussion already about African-American and Black churches, potentially other community providers. What are some of the pieces of advice that you would offer to the teams in terms of thinking about how to take that high touch, high tech, and blend them into a formula that'll really be specifically applied to a certain indication and a certain community?
So I guess what I'll put out is keep in mind that we're not just talking about apps to try to get people to buy more sandwiches at Panera, or apps to try to get people to use this rideshare versus another. And it's not even just an app for health. These are clinical trials typically involving an investigational new medicine. That is a daunting and scary proposition. And I think that's where the mix of tech and human factors are so critical. The decision to participate in a clinical trial is a very big deal. This involves a person who has a disease and may already be taking a medicine, stopping that medicine and putting their faith in this investigational medicine that's not approved and whose data we don't know if this is going to benefit them or not. And certainly our informed consent makes that very clear. Participating in these trials can also be scary. There are questions and fears that will come up about their safety and their wellness. We have to make sure that even as we're trying to introduce these technology solutions, that we're not leaving people abandoned with a bottle of an investigational medicine and an unfamiliar technology to strap on their wrist and telling them good luck. And so think about models like at Ochsner down in New Orleans, where they've implemented an O-bar, their own little genius bar in the lobbies of a dozen of their hospitals. How might we start to have more of a virtual genius bar, or other ways to make sure that there's the right level of support for these individuals so that they never feel left alone with that bottle and a gadget?
That's a terrific point, Craig. Thank you.
Building off of that, I think really thinking about that human experience. We've talked about user experience. Since it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, I'll use that as an oncology research example. How many folks on this call have been touched by breast cancer or know someone in their communities that has been touched by this disease? Is what you're recommending in this business plan competition something that you would be proud to recommend to a family member, a community member? Because that's what we're asking, essentially, all of our entire clinical trial teams to go out and do, to really to build a product that they're proud of, but also to be a part of a much longer research journey. So just cautioning if we can balance that desire to make a change with something that we can implement, as well as really thinking creatively about where we can best make an impact.
Victoria, can I follow up on that? I think we've got a couple extra minutes here, and I just wanted to, I lost my mom to cancer back in 2009, so that journey is very, very personal to me. And I'd also encourage exactly what you said for the teams, which is think about your own personal experiences, the experiences that your friends and family members have had traveling through the medical system with diseases and ailments, sometimes very serious and uncommon, and sometimes less serious but chronic and still debilitating, that impact the quality of life. And what would you wish was different for them, and how can you work with them and their understanding in those communities to find solutions there? But I wanted to talk about one specific element, Victoria, about that clinical trial experience, which is even for experts. And I think you and I probably talked about this. Full disclosure, Victoria was also at the FDA and I was at the FDA, and we would talk about this. So even for expert oncologists, when a friend of theirs would have a cancer diagnosis, it was hard for them to know where to go and how to identify a trial. There is clinicaltrials.gov. I think it's generally perceived as pretty clunky. Do you think there's also an opportunity there to democratize the opportunity to triage participation in clinical trials? What kind of platforms, opportunities could we think about for networking that I think all of us are probably bombarded with information, opportunities to participate in lots of programs and products through our email? It seems like getting it easier and more understandable, with the understanding this is a highly regulated industry, but we've got to be able to do better. Have you given any thought about that, or what kind of suggestions you might have to the teams about that particular pain point, which is putting it in lay language and making it easier to find a trial that a patient might qualify for?
Yeah, I think that element of lay language, right? I mean, if it's for anyone navigating this, it may take 70 pages of informed consent before you can decide if you want to join or not. The patient may rightfully say no, right? And so being able to, whether that's that community navigator or having someone speaking your patient's home language, that ability to really make an impact in navigating a very complex ecosystem For some people, maybe it is that going to a person at an O bar to get that question answered. For others, it might be how can they get this answered virtually if the community is more dispersed and not able to travel. Just having, I think, that balanced cognition of what the barriers and challenges are, but then realizing in our privileged state as participants of research in this community, maybe checking some of our own biases or knowledge at the door to think, what might someone else need when they're coming into this for the first time?
And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Craig, too, in terms of the complexity even experts can run into when they're trying to sort their way through the clinical trial opportunities.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, certainly clinicaltrials.gov, which I know Kim just dropped a link in, it lets people down in terms of being accessible and information people can understand. As Victoria pointed out, we're tasked as operators for studies with making sure our consent language is reduced down to a more accessible reading level, but it'll still be a 30-page document of very complex language. And then we want to translate that and make sure that it's still supporting that accessibility. And so there's a lot we can do, and there may be ways that we can leverage supplemental technologies, whether video or other ways, to help make complex content much more accessible for everyone.
And that would be understanding also how specific communities or specific subgroups in communities, patients who might be older, who might speak a different language, as you said, what's their trusted source of information? How do you provide that information in a format that's accessible and trusted to them? That's a great point. I think we are just 3 minutes before our stopping point. Do either of you have any final thoughts that I haven't covered that you'd like to offer before we turn it back to Debbie? Okay, that's great. I think we'll save a minute or two and hand it back to Debbie to take it to our next phase. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul, Craig, Victoria, an equally brilliant and compelling conversation. So thank you so much for all of your great thoughts and sharing of yourselves and your expertise. So we have another important session before we go into our breakout rooms. So with us today to share valuable insight on how technology is transforming health outcomes, please welcome Chief Clinical Officer for Verily Health Platforms, Dr. Vindell Washington. Dr. Washington, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion today. I was contemplating and sort of reflecting on some of the comments from the last session, and I think there's going to be a little bit of a Groundhog Day and some of the themes, which may actually be a positive. But there are two concepts I think about sometimes, this sort of specific idea around health equity and clinical trials as almost planting a garden. And that, I mean, there's sort of two things that are absolute prerequisites. One was referenced before, which is this idea of trust. So do the communities in which you're asking these questions, the communities that you're asking to participate, do they trust you as an investigator? And maybe sometimes more importantly, has your institution earned their trust over time? Often that is not the case, and it's really ignored at the peril of those doing the investigation. This is not just individual trust, but I'm speaking in this case around community trust. And the second concept that was referenced that I think is also an absolute prerequisite is, how hard is it to participate? This is one of the areas I think that technology has had a great possibility of improving this space. But the idea of, is the right thing the easy thing in terms of what you've asked folks to do in these efforts? So in the last session, you heard things around bringing trials to folks as opposed to asking them to catch a couple of buses right across town or navigate a difficult parking situation to get to you, to provide you the opportunity for this interaction. It goes all the way from how easy it is from that perspective, also to things that are slightly more controversial in terms of, are you reimbursing people for participation? How have you decided to do that in a way that removes and reduces the burden? There's a lot of indication that one of the ways to sort of increase the health equity and participation is to sort of make it financially more easy for folks to participate in those trials. And I think those are important considerations. But after the sort of the ground is tilled and the fertilizer is sown, we think about 6 kind of concepts in terms of, or strategies in terms of trying to move this forward, and the framework around increasing health equity and removing some of the barriers. The first is a little bit counterintuitive here in my generation, and you grew up with the sort of concept of a colorblind healthcare delivery system. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure where I dropped out, but I was sort of saying that really after the groundwork is set, and that these issues of trust and this framework on how easy it is to participate have been addressed, we've settled and barely on really 6 concepts or strategies that we think that are relatively important to increasing health equity and reducing the disparities that we see in trials. First is really a little bit counterintuitive to where we've been in medicine. At least for me, I grew up in an age where a lot of the effort was on making sure that people had equality as sort of the push. And so a colorblind delivery of medicine. And what I would say from a research perspective is that we need to not only set specific data goals to address representation gaps, but also the endpoints that can inform future trial recruitment and engagement goals in vulnerable populations, which means you actually have to be really specific about how and what you count. And so if you want to make sure that you're making progress in those spaces, you darn sure better well know who's participating in your trial, know where your blind spots might potentially be. The second is that you really have to engage the communities that are targeted with some degree of humility. We've used the term in our company, humble inquiry, which is to say, it's not actually in your best interest to assume that your approach is the right approach. You have to ask questions. You want to make sure that your permissions and consents are culturally appropriate, that you're looking at ideas around health literacy and information sharing. So again, when you go to study communities, make sure that you've approached that exercise in an inquisitive way. The third may seem a little evident, kind of sort of more in vogue these days than maybe in years past, but that is that the actual research and leadership teams themselves have to demonstrate some degree of diversity, equity, and inclusion so that the right questions are asked. And I don't mean to say that just because I have brown skin, I know what every person with brown skin in America wants in a trial, but you have a better chance of covering the bases if the teams that you're bringing to the table for this work are diverse as you approach the problems that are before you. The fourth construct is really around being thoughtful about the research limits and the eligibility criteria. These days, this isn't quite as hard a sell as it's been in the past. I think specifically with BioNJ's aducanumab challenges where you had a dementia drug that was sort of put forward where there was good initial research done, but there were problems based on representation. So you take something like dementia where older Black adults have a higher incidence of disease, you put out a study and you don't have very many of those folks in your trial. I'm going to read specifically from the JAMA Neurology Viewpoint, which basically said, FDA approval was based on trials that were not inclusive of the people who bear a disproportionate burden of disease. Only 0.6%, in parentheses, 19 individuals of participants identified as Black, 3% as Hispanic, 0.03% as American Indian or Alaska Native, and 0.03% as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And of the 9% identified as Asian, 94% were recruited in Asia. So as you know, the code of that story, because it's already played out to a degree, the drug went to market, but CMS decided not to pay for it based in part on this representation. So the concept here that we think is particularly important is that the eligibility criteria and the thoughtfulness that goes in the pre-work specifically around is the outcome applicable to the populations that we're hoping to serve is an important effort. Another one that's sort of in the same vein, but is sort of more generalizable, is in this area of research on congestive heart failure. So we know that Black men are 70% more likely to have heart failure, Black women 50% more likely, mainly based on a higher incidence of diseases like hypertension and diabetes. And in our communities, the specific construct that we're talking about here means that if you're doing a trial, and if you look across all of what's done in heart failure, about 6% of the trial entrants over the last 5 or 7 years or so are African American, where they represent about 35% of those who suffer with the disease process. And so there may be insights that are missed by missing this fourth point. The fifth point I want to make is really around something that may have been covered a bit before, but I'll just underscore it again, which is it may be important to tailor the recruitment methods for the diverse communities that you're chasing. So at Verily, we looked at, in our study about predictors of severe COVID-19 outcomes, knowing that COVID had a disproportionate effect on minority populations, means it's super important to make sure that you have enrollment strategies that are specifically targeted. And sometimes I think there's pressure to say, we have to do this thing that's quick. We have to do this as an additional burden upon us. But if the outcomes of your research are going to be as valuable as we all hope, this idea of a recruitment strategy in order to sort of push forward, that is absolutely important in this effort. And then the last point goes back to this ways to reduce barriers. And we in particular at Verily are focused on this concept of clinical trial decentralization, so that it doesn't always take the trip across town or always take the trip of a car ride. And we think that that's really how modernization of the clinical research model allows us to reach people where they are. So a lot in tech, we spend a lot of time on this concept of the job to be done. So like obsessively focusing on what the job to be done. And so some of the jobs to be done in this space are specifically technical in the work. But I would say, and I hope that your impression of this is that many of these and many of the thought processes that are required are pre-technical. So technical solutions come from identifying these jobs to be done. And so in our shop, for example, we have several different types of folks whose job it is and their training is to make sure that we're thinking specifically about this effort. We have human factors engineers and their ideas to make sure that the flow and the process and the engineering sort of meets those right categorical elements that you might expect as the title implies. But we also have a slew of folks around behavioral economists and user experience researchers. And the purpose there, and I think it was alluded to before, is that there's a specific body of knowledge that allows us to think deeply about what is the experience of those who are trying to follow the guidelines, trying to participate in the construct that is being put forward. So we're sort of what I would say single-mindedly focused on making sure that we are, as a technology-oriented company, not contributing to the health inequities that exist in the system. And we think those 6 constructs, the 6 criteria, particularly when it comes to research, are our guidelines that we use internally to help us get to that point. And thanks a lot for allowing me to spend a few minutes speaking about that this morning.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Vidal. Appreciate you sharing your expertise. And do we have any questions for Dr. Washington? Okay, seeing none. If you do come up with a question, you can certainly feel free to put it in the chat. So thank you again, Dr. Washington, just terrific. And so now we will move into our mentoring. Here we go. We do have from Dr. Paul Howard. Could you please talk about that mindset more? It seems like it's an engineering mindset.
Yeah, it's an interesting framework. I would say it is absolutely an engineering mindset. And what I would say about it is, and this is, I've been at Verily now 3 years, I would say it is a new construct for me, but everything that I just described is both very measured and both, I would say, it's a design that is particularly followed, and you can actually draw it out, and it's almost like a release cycle. So if you think about a train that goes from left to right, things like product inclusivity and this question about the clinical research eligibility criteria, we view it in the same way we would on release of a big tech product, which means it doesn't necessarily mean that every single product does the same thing for every group that's being offered. But you really can't, in our system, release a product unless you have gone through the algorithms that allow you to say yes, no on that. And I think it's a critical concept. And one reason I'm particularly passionate about it is I've been through enough cycles in medicine where, occasionally health disparities and this idea of health equity sort of pops up as a sort of a hot topic and disappears. But this concept of saying it is part of a release cycle and part of design means that every single trial, every single product released has to have this sort of structured approach. And we absolutely do that when we're sort of applying for FDA grants and NIH grants, because we can't get funded without it. But I would say, even though at this point FDA is sort of considering it, unless you make this part of a process, then I think it's at risk as being sort of more of a fad, and it may indeed disappear over some period of time. So I would just offer that as at least as the way that we sort of think about it.
Terrific, thank you. And Paul just added in the chat, Vindel, terrific explanation. Thank you so much. So, and I echo that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So now we're going to move into our mentoring sessions, and we are really excited to give our students here the opportunity to speak with members of BioNJ's steering committee, as well as some of the industry experts that you heard from today, who will serve as expert advisors. And so for those of you who are not a student or a BioNJ expert advisor, you are welcome to sign off at this moment, and with our sincere and humble thanks. We very much appreciate your participation, and we hope you'll stay engaged with the initiative, and wish you a wonderful weekend. So, and for our students and advisors, you don't need to do anything at all. We're going to move you into a breakout room, a pre-assigned breakout room with your fellow students. There may be a couple that have two schools together. After that, we will bring you back here for very brief closing remarks and sort of next steps, and ask you to just give us a minute or two to move everyone. And please make sure that you have your name and your university name in the webcam, and ask lots of questions. So we will see you in a moment.
Other rooms will be joining in a few seconds or a few minutes. So please feel free to engage with one another to keep the conversation moving.
Sounds great, Randy. And yeah, some of my friends, my new friends from Hopkins from my room are here. But if anyone from Team Pitt has any other questions, or anyone else here in the room has an area, whether an insight they heard today that they wanted to interrogate further or further validate. My background leans heavy into the use of digital and decentralization in clinical trials, so I'm certainly also happy to go deeper there if it's helpful.
And for those from Johns Hopkins, we also have another one of our experts, Sarah, on the line. So who you heard from. So it's a great way to ask each other questions that might apply to others in the room.
Yeah. Absolutely, and as I shared with my breakout room, I'm a lawyer, so I come at this from a different perspective, but definitely glad to answer any questions that you all have.
Sarah, I don't know about you, but I had a team of MPH MBAs that were very much at the intersection of health and equity and business. So it was a fun conversation about how to do well and do good, and make sure that we have initiatives that can drive positive change, but are also business sustainable.
Yeah, we actually had a pretty similar conversation. We talked about the clinical trial diversity, and it was specifically with respect to how some of the smaller companies who are pre-commercial may be impacted by some of the potential requirements from FDA, like what they're facing with respect to FDA expectations from the agency. And so how do they tackle that, given that they have different types of resources and different access than some of the larger pharma and biotechnology companies. So
yeah, it's fascinating, right? And right now it's from the FDA, it's just guidance. It's not really carrots and sticks yet, but is that going to follow, especially when we see policy floating that's bipartisan, amazingly, in areas like the Diverse Trials Act and the DEPICT Act, which both lean in around diversity and call out, expectations rather than just guidance.
right, yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see, how they all come out.
I've always believed if you look at the way we've incentivized rare disease research in this country, if you use the same carrots for diversity, something tells me people are going to invest in solving inclusion in trials. If all of a sudden you add an extension of exclusivity for that medicine, I'm feeling people will figure this out.
I agree with you 100%. Yes.
One of the data points that stuck out in our room also was that one I think Irfan mentioned this morning: 200 zip codes out of thousands in this country are basically the same lakes that we just keep fishing in, right? Probably because they're the 200 most population dense zip codes. So when we're looking at where people are, we just keep going back to the same. But all of those others that don't have access to participate aren't being invited.
Yeah.
Everyone's coming back, so welcome back. And Debbie Hart, you're on mute. I think you're welcoming everyone back, but you're on mute. I see you talking.
I was trying. Thank you, Randy. So welcome back. I think, are we all back, Randy or Aaron? We're all okay, great. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for participating in the breakouts. I was in a room with some brilliant students having just a tremendous conversation. Thank you also to our experts. We very much appreciate it. And, I hope you are as excited as I am about this continuing program. As we often say at BioNJ, it takes a village, and we are just so blessed that we have a brilliant one working with us on this project, including you all. So thank you to our village, our speakers, expert advisors, steering committee, program sponsors, and most of all, our students for joining us. I hope that you are inspired and excited to make a difference on behalf of patients. And with that, I would like to hand it back over to Paul Howard, who's going to deliver a few words, and then I just have some technical information to close us out. So Paul, back to you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I think I've got 10 minutes slotted for this, but I'm not going to take the whole 10 minutes because I'm also a big fan of giving people more time back to their day. And I think we've heard a tremendous discussion today where the information was not only extraordinarily helpful, but extraordinarily clear and well delivered. I think the message that we heard this morning from Amadou is really we have both a moral imperative and a scientific imperative to develop more inclusive and representative clinical trials that can help us develop more impactful treatments for patients. This aligns very well both with our goal as a society in the wake of COVID and to advance social justice, but it also permits us as an industry to effectively take more shots on goal. As our understanding of biology and medicine advances, we're understanding that increasingly we have to tailor medicines and clinical support for patients that can vary based on the age, that patient, the stage of the disease they're in, but also their personal preferences, what they want to achieve, what their goals are for their treatment, and how to maintain their quality of life throughout the course of that journey that they're on with their condition, and get them to the best possible outcome, no matter what their socioeconomic status might be. I was really encouraged by the discussion that Sarah had with her terrific panel. The importance of being able to work with deeply embedded community partners that can help us understand issues around trust and access, and be more engaging with the patients, and particularly the importance of starting out with cultural humility. We have a lot of assumptions that we all have about the world that we move in that might be appropriate for us or our social group, but aren't true for other patients, other populations, people in other circumstances. So starting from a real humble point of view and really asking them, how do you experience this disease state? How do you use technology? How do you access information? And not assuming that if you talk to one person, you've gotten all that information, but really talking to a broad spectrum of individuals in that community, in that situation, so you can understand the full life cycle of experience with that disease state, and how they really want to engage with the medical community when there is an opportunity to participate in clinical trials. And then, I think that there's a wonderful, theme that we developed throughout, my conversation too, about specific technology platforms that you can really pick and choose. This is not an all or nothing question. We got a question during the breakout I just had. Do you need to tackle all of these policy, regulatory questions or technology questions? And my answer is, oh my gosh, no. This is, really your opportunity to develop a really tailored, focused solution to a problem that you've experienced, that a loved one's experienced, that has really, maybe an issue in the news or the history of medicine that's gotten you really energized. So, I think the more tailored and deeply embedded you can make your solution set, and I welcome any other comment on this from my colleagues, I think the easier it'll be for you to iterate a really scalable solution and to work with a patient group, a community-based partner, to come up with innovative solutions there. And again, this is something that you can dial up or dial down depending on what the needs and opportunities are, but there are lots of potential tools and technologies that can take a high-tech solution and apply it in a real high-trust environment with those deeply embedded patient partners. Dr. Washington spoke about the centrality of trust and the importance of the 6 concepts that he developed, which I thought were excellent, and I don't want to repeat them here. I will just say that I thought that the mindset that he brought to that conversation, we talked about it being design thinking, engineering thinking. You don't have to be a designer or an engineer to apply that framework of thinking. It's a real design, test, build mindset that really begins from that position of humility and working with your community partners and your patient partners and physicians and other trusted community providers to understand what's really going to work and be effective in that community and that indication. And that's not going to get you to a one, instantly perfect answer. You're going to have to iterate and go back through that cycle, perhaps multiple times, but it's certainly a way to rapidly align on key aspects of your solution that you can really fine tune to deliver more effective engagement for clinical trial opportunities. So I just wanted to stop there and encourage everyone to continue to reach out to us for support. We hope that every team here participates in the competition. We're excited. We're very ready to support you and move us all forward on this journey to develop shared solutions to support the patient communities and advance public health. So I will stop there and hand the baton back to Debbie.
Thank you so much, Paul. And, I just quick reminder that any business plans that are submitted will all be collated into a white paper. They will all be published and available and pushed out widely with all of your names on them, right? Also, we are hoping that, again, as I mentioned at the outset, that we are introducing you to an exciting new world where you might consider continuing, and you will be meeting lots of experts and industry people along the way who may be able to assist you in figuring out your future and perhaps even being a part of it. So again, thank you to all of our village Thank you, especially to our students. I hope that you are inspired, excited to make a difference on behalf of patients. There were lots of, sort of housekeeping, but important, critically important items in the chat in the last couple of minutes. But just to reiterate a couple of them, visit our website for additional resources. The address is on the screen. And I just need a moment to get back to my script. If you haven't registered your team yet via the official registration form, the deadline to do so is November 6th. Also, you will be receiving an evaluation survey via email in the coming days, and those who complete it will be eligible for a Grubhub gift card in the amount of $25. Invite you to please reach out to Samantha Mayberry for any questions. And I just can't wait to see the results that your brilliant minds bring forward. And thank you all so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thanks.